Good day, everyone. I am Aaron Beth Belbas together with Crystal Silva, and today we will be presenting about designing and evaluating portfolio assessment in the classroom. So, as a future teachers, it is not enough that we only give tests or quizzes to our students. We must also understand how to assess students' learning over time, not just in one sitting. That is where portfolio assessment becomes very useful. So now let's define um, what portfolio assessment is. So a portfolio assessment is a systematic collection of student work that shows their growth, progress, and achievements over a period of time. So let me emphasize the phrase over a period of time. This means that we are not only looking at one activity, we are not also focusing on final answers, but rather we are observing how the student improves step by step. So, for example, if a student is learning how to write, of course, at first, their paragraph may have many grammar errors, and then after practice, their sentences becomes clearer, and then later on, they can already write a complete essay. So, if we only look at the final output, we may miss the struggle and improvement. But through a portfolio, we can clearly see the learning journey of the student. However, portfolio assessment is not just about collecting papers. It also requires careful and intentional planning. So let me ask you, if you were a teacher, what would be the first thing you consider before creating a portfolio assessment? So for me, the first thing I would consider is the purpose and learning objectives of the portfolio. Why? Because I think this is important because the portfolio must align with what I want my students to learn. Without a clear purpose, the portfolio may become a simple collection of outputs without meaningful assessment. So, for example, if my goal is to develop students' writing skills, I will include essays, drafts, and revisions, not unrelated activities. So, therefore, identifying the purpose ensures that the portfolio is focused, relevant, and effective. There are six steps in developing a portfolio assessment. First, you need to identify purpose and focus, just like what I said earlier. And then the second is you need to identify physical structure. Third is determine the content and organization. Fourth is set reflection guidelines. Next is identify the scoring criteria. And lastly, you need to communicate results. So we will now discuss each step in detail. The first step is to identify your purpose and focus. So, as a teacher, you must be clear about why am I using a portfolio? What skills do I want to assess? Kailangan mo munang itanong to sa sarili mo bago mo pagawin sa students. Because if your purpose is not clear, your portfolio will become disorganized and meaningless. Example, if your goal is to improve reading comprehension, your portfolio may include reading logs, story summaries, reaction papers. But if your goal is mathematical problem solving, then your portfolio should include solutions to word problems, step by step computations, or reflections on solving strategies. So you need to remember that you should not mix unrelated outputs. Wag mong Huwag mong ipalagay yung mga hindi naman kailangan ng students. So everything inside the portfolio must support your learning objectives. Here is some examples of preparing to use a portfolio. So you can see what who will construct the portfolio. May mga checklist, and then may mga question na kailangan mong sagutan. Okay. Now, if you were teaching grade 4, which would you prefer to use? A clear book, a folder, or digital portfolio? So for me, I would prefer a clear book because it allows students to organize their work neatly and makes it easy for both the teacher and students to view their outputs. So at the grade 4 level, I think students still need guidance in organizing materials, and um, I believe the clear book provides a structured and visible way to present their work. So, although digital portfolios are useful, they may not be practical due to limited access to gadgets or internet. Uh, Kasi hindi naman lahat ng students is merong gadgets na pwede nilang gamitin, and also some of the students they lack access to internet if ang bahay nila is malayo sa sa city, or walang signal sa lugar nila. So therefore, a clear book is a practical, accessible, and organized option for elementary learners. Sa akin lang yun. That's my opinion. So now let's move on to the second step. So the second step is deciding the physical structure of the portfolio. So this refers to what it looks like, how it is stored, and how students will use it. So you need to consider practical questions such as, will it be a clear book, folder, or digital portfolio? Where will students keep it, and how will they access it easily? So, for example, a clear book is organized and presentable but may be costly. Sa folder naman, it is cheaper but may easily tear or madaling mapunit pag nabasa. And then the digital portfolio, modern siya but it requires gadgets and internet. So, as a teacher, you must consider the students' resources, the classroom situation, and then the accessibility. Because even the best plan will fail if it is not practical. Now, let's move on to the third step. Here in the third step is you need the content of the portfolio includes student outputs that provide evidence of learning. But here is the important part. Not all student work should be included. So you must carefully select outputs that truly represent the learning progress, the skill development, and then the achievement. So, for example, instead of including 10 similar worksheets, you may include their first attempt with errors, the improved version, and then the final output. So, this way, you show progress, not repetition. Also, you must organize the portfolio properly. So, it can be arranged chronologically by date, by subject, and then by skill. Another example is in a writing portfolio, uh, there's draft 1, draft 2, the final essay, and then the reflection. So this will allow both the teacher and the student to clearly see the improvement. So do you think that students should reflect on their work, and Why? S- Crystal Silva will now answer that question for you.
To answer this question, the students should not only collect their work, they should also reflect on their own learning because it helps develop their metacognitive skills. Now imagine this situation. Both students submitted their drawings. One is colorful and neat, while the other is simpler but shows creativity and improvement from previous works. So, as teachers, how do we assess them fairly? How do we help children reflect on their work? And how do we communicate feedback in a way that encourages them? So, this is where steps 4 to 6 become important. So the fourth step is determining student reflection guidelines. So this means teachers should guide students on how to reflect on their own work and learning experiences. So as you can see on the screen, there's this questions that help the students gain metacognitive skills. So in elementary education, reflection is very important because children are still developing self-awareness. They are learning how to recognize their strengths, mistakes, feelings, and progress. So, without reflection, a portfolio simply becomes a collection of papers. But with reflection, the portfolio becomes a record of growth. So, reflection helps children think beyond getting high scores. Instead of asking only, did I pass? They begin asking, what did I learn? And what was difficult for me? For instance, for week reflection, I enjoyed this activity. While for better reflection, at first, I had difficulty reading the story because I was shy. But after practicing, I became more confident in pronouncing the words. Notice how the second reflection shows learning, struggle, and improvement. That is the kind of reflection teachers should guide students to make. So, the fifth step is identifying and evaluating scoring criteria. First, set how student work will be graded. Next, or the most important, involve students in making the criteria. Next, builds responsibility and teamwork. And next, teacher ensures that it is clear and fair. Lastly, share criteria so students understand expectations. So this means teachers should establish clear standards or rubrics before assessing the portfolio. In elementary assessment, this is important because young learners need fairness and clear expectations. Without scoring criteria, assessment can become subjective. Teachers might unconsciously favor outputs that are neat, colorful, or aesthetically pleasing, even if the learning content is weak. So, scoring criteria help teachers focus on the actual learning objectives instead of the personal preferences. I actually generated this example using AI for you to see the difference. So, for example, in the first portfolio, it is attractive, but some information is incorrect. While in the second portfolio, it is simple, but the content is accurate and the student explained the concept clearly. So, if we only base grades on appearance, the assessment becomes unfair. Also, the first portfolio might receive a higher score because it is colorful and attractive. However, portfolio assessment should focus not only on presentation, but also on understanding, effort, accuracy, and improvement. That is why scoring criteria or rubrics are important. So, this is an example of a criteria related to the example I provided on the previous slide. So, in this question, the teacher should also discuss the student's strength, areas for improvement, the learning progress, and their effort during the activity. Because portfolio assessment is not only about grades, but also about learning development. The sixth step is communicating the results of portfolio evaluation. This means that teachers provide feedback to students and even parents regarding the learner's progress. In elementary education, communication is very important because feedback affects a child's confidence and motivation. Young learners are emotionally sensitive. If feedback is too harsh, they may become discouraged. But if feedback is constructive, children become more motivated to improve. For instance, for weak feedback needs improvement, while in the better feedback, you organized your ideas well. Try adding more details to strengthen your story. Notice how the second feedback guides improvement while still encouraging the learner. Now, let's talk about portfolio evaluation. Portfolio evaluation usually includes three parts. These three parts make the evaluation more complete and meaningful. In student evaluation, one advantage of portfolio assessment is allowing the students to revisit, reflect, and evaluate their own work. It also helps them understand their learning and progress. A student might say, I chose this project because it shows how my drawing improved compared to my first activity. So, in this way, it helps them recognize their growth. So, here are the questions the teacher might ask the students to help the learners evaluate their learning progress. First, why did you choose this work? What did you learn? What are your strengths and weaknesses? What challenges did you face? Which part made you proud? Is this your best work? And lastly, what do you want to improve next time?
Now let's move on to the second component, which is the teacher evaluation. So this is where academic rigor comes in. So as a teacher, you must evaluate based on clear criteria, establish standards, and then the evidence from the portfolio. So dito, napaka-importante na rubric. Kasi kung wala kang rubric, paano mo mai-evaluate o paano mo mage-grade ng maayos yung student? So, hindi ka dito basta-basta, hindi mo basta-bastang ge-gradean yung student kasi paborito mo, kasi siya yung pinakamatalinong student sa class. So, hindi ganun yung pag-evaluate ng teacher. So, sa rubric, meron tayong set of criteria. The content, critical thinking, yung organization, yung reflection quality, yung progress over time. Kasi kahit napakaganda ng final output ng student, pag wala yung evidence of process or reflection, the portfolio is incomplete. On the other hand, a student who shows clear improvement and reflection may receive a higher evaluation, even if the final output is not perfect. Because portfolio assessment values growth, not just performance. Next, the third component is the student-teacher conference. So this is what makes portfolio evaluation interactive and meaningful. So anong nangyayari dito? So in student-teacher conference, the students presents their portfolio and then the teacher will ask questions. Siyempre, kailangan ng questions kung anong ginawa nila, anong revision ang nangyari, yung journey ng students. And then, there is a discussion about learning. Dito na nangyayari yung reflection. Ano ba yung natutunan ng students sa journey nila throughout the learning process. What makes portfolio evaluation strong is the combination of student evaluation, teacher evaluation, the conference discussion. So this is called triangulation, meaning we do not rely on just one perspective. So this increases validity, reliability, and fairness. So as future educators, um, we must avoid these mistakes. First, grading based only on completeness. Second is ignoring student reflection. Third is using unclear criteria. Fourth is giving feedback too late. And lastly, treating all outputs equally. So if traditional assessments ask what students know, in portfolio evaluation, it asks how students learn, how they improve, and how they think about their learning.
To check your understanding, you may answer this by leaving your response in the comment section. So imagine you will create a postcard to a teacher or a classmate, as if you are sending them advice and helpful suggestions about designing or evaluating a portfolio effectively. For example, dear teacher or peer, make sure each student reflects on their learning journey so the portfolio truly shows growth. So that's all, and thank you, everyone.